The spare room door was open when Birdie Barrett finally broke. She stood in the narrow hallway of Frank Ramsey's homestead, her back pressed against the wall planks, her hand over her mouth to keep the sound inside her chest where it belonged. Through the thin partition of wood and dried mud plaster, she could hear the wind raking across the Kansas plains, that long, merciless moan that had followed her every mile from Dodge City. She had told herself she would leave before sunrise. She had told herself that every morning for 6 weeks. And now it was spring, and there were wildflowers coming up along the fence line, purple and gold and white against the black soil. And Frank Ramsey was standing in his kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and his jaw set hard, and his eyes full of something that looked dangerously close to the word she could not let herself say. Birdie. His voice was low, roughened with the kind of restraint a man builds like a callus, layer by layer, over years of keeping his own counsel. You are going to tell me what Holt Deegan said to you in town this morning, or I swear to you I will go find him myself and ask him directly. She turned away from him. She looked at the wildflowers through the small window at the end of the hall. He knows, she said. He knows who I am, what I was. He's going to tell everyone in Caldwell before the week is out, Frank, and when he does, everything you've built here, your land deal, your reputation, everything, it gets buried right alongside mine. The silence that followed was the most dangerous kind, the kind that is not empty but absolutely full. She had carried a secret like a stone in her boot for 3 years, and it had finally caught up with her in the very place she had begun to believe might be safe. She had been wrong about safe places before. She had been catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. "Tell me something," Frank said, and he stepped into the hallway, close enough that she could smell the barn on his coat and the cedar soap he used, and the particular warmth of a man who had spent his morning in hard physical work. "You think what Holt Deegan knows about your past is something that changes what I think of you." She closed her eyes. She had to go back to the beginning if she was going to make him understand why she could not simply accept the question at face value, why it was not the straightforward thing he believed it to be. She had to go back to October, to the night this whole impossible, terrifying, beautiful disaster had started. The Santa Fe Trail through southern Kansas in the autumn of 1882 was not a road for a woman traveling alone, and Birdie Barrett knew it better than anyone. She had lived by her wits long enough to know the difference between calculated risk and genuine stupidity, and what she was doing, walking the last 4 miles into Caldwell with a carpetbag that weighed more than it should and a story that would not hold up under serious questioning, was somewhere squarely in the second category. She was 26 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she kept pinned severely back because it attracted the wrong kind of attention when she did not, and gray eyes that people often described as unsettling, which she had decided years ago to take as a compliment. She had a bruise along her left cheekbone that she had done her best to cover with powder, and she had $11.40 in her coat pocket, which was the entire remainder of what had once been a much more substantial sum. The town of Caldwell, Kansas sat right at the edge of the Cherokee Strip, the last stop before Indian Territory, and in 1882 it was still wild enough to make Wichita look like a church social. The cattle drive still passed through in season. The saloons outnumbered the churches by a ratio that would have given any minister pause. The marshal's office had seen 4 different marshals in 3 years, which was either a testament to the town's danger or its politics or both. Birdie had chosen it because it was the kind of place where people did not ask too many questions about where you had come from. She had not counted on the questions catching up with her on the road before she even arrived. She had not counted on the wheel of the eastbound stage to Wichita coming off its axle on the crossing just south of town, dumping all the passengers and luggage into the October mud and leaving them to walk or wait. She had chosen to walk. Most of the other passengers had chosen to wait. That choice, that small logistical decision, was the first thread in what became a very long and complicated knot. She had been walking for 2 miles when the rider pulled alongside her. He was on a dark bay quarter horse, a well-made animal with good bone and a calm eye, which told her something about its owner before she looked up. When she did look up, she saw a man somewhere in his early 30s, lean and broad-shouldered in a worn canvas duster, with a face that had been made interesting by weather and time rather than by conventional arrangement of features. He had dark brown eyes and a jaw that was slightly uneven from an old break that had not been set perfectly, and he was looking at her with an expression that was cautious and direct in equal measure. "Stage go down?" he asked. "Wheel," she said, not slowing her pace. "It's another 2 miles into town. I am aware of that." He stayed alongside her at his horse's walking pace for a moment, and she felt the particular discomfort of being assessed without the pretense of not being assessed. "You have people in Caldwell?" he asked. "I have a carpetbag and $11, she said. "That is functionally equivalent." He was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he made a short sound that might have been the preliminary stages of a laugh. "Frank Ramsey," he said. "I've got a spread 4 miles south of town. I'm heading in for supplies." She did not offer her name. She kept walking. "It's going to rain," he said. She looked at the sky. He was right. The clouds coming in from the northwest had that particular iron-gray density that meant business. "I can see that," she said. "The Drover's Rest in town charges $1.50 a night," he said. "I've got a spare room. It's nothing fancy. Clean bed, sound roof. You'd be welcome to it for the night while you get your feet under you." She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him fully for the first time, the way she had learned to look at people, cataloging what they revealed and what they tried to conceal, reading the gap between the two. What she saw in Frank Ramsey was a man who was genuinely uncomfortable with the offer he had just made, which meant he had not made it from practiced charm or ulterior motive, but from some stubborn, inconvenient strain of basic human decency. She also saw a man with dark circles under his eyes and a set to his shoulders that spoke of carrying something heavy for a long time. She saw someone who was, in that particular way, not entirely unlike herself. "I do not know you," she said. "No," he agreed, "and you do not know me." "No," he said again. "A spare room," she repeated. "A spare room," he confirmed. Nothing else implied or expected. "I have a barn full of stock that needs tending and a 40-acre field that needs winterizing before the first hard freeze, and I have got no interest in complicating my life further." There was something so deeply, specifically honest in that last sentence that it almost made her laugh. She did not laugh, but she looked at the sky again, and she felt the first cold drop of rain hit the back of her hand, and she thought about the $1.50 she did not have to spare. "All right," she said. "One night." "One night," he said. His name was Frank Ramsey, and he had come to Kansas from Missouri in 1878, which was 4 years before she arrived on the road outside Caldwell in the October rain. He had come with savings from 5 years of working cattle drives up from Texas, and a specific, stubborn vision of his own land under his own boots, and nothing else except a practical knowledge of horses and cattle, and the kind of silence that men develop when they have spent years working in country too big for conversation. He had bought the property from a man named Aldous Crane, who had decided that Kansas winters were not worth the cost, and retreated to his wife's family in St. Louis. The land was 40 acres of mixed prairie and creek bottom, with a small but solidly built house of stone and timber, a good barn, a functional well, and a reputation in the surrounding county as reliable grazing ground. Frank had spent 4 years improving what was already there and adding to it. He had dug a better root cellar. He had added a second room to the house. He had cleared another 12 acres for cultivation and planted a kitchen garden that his neighbor's wife, Clara Holt, called the best-kept kitchen garden she had seen west of the Missouri River. He had done all of this alone. He was 32 years old, and he had been alone since the death of his wife, Margaret, in the spring of 1880 from the fever that took 6 people in the county that season. He did not talk about Margaret. He did not stop thinking about her. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and he had arranged his life around the careful management of that particular contradiction. The spare room had been Margaret's sewing room. He had not changed anything in it after she died. He had not been able to bring himself to change it, and then enough time had passed that not changing it had become its own kind of decision. There was a small iron bed with a good mattress, a braided rug on the plank floor, a window that looked west toward the creek in the cottonwoods, a shelf with 3 books and a small blue glass vase that Margaret had brought from her mother's house in Jefferson City. When Birdie Barrett walked into that room for the first time, carrying her carpetbag and wearing an expression of someone who had long since stopped expecting rooms to be comfortable or kind, she stopped in the doorway and looked at the blue glass vase for a long moment. "This was someone's room," she said. "It was not a question." "Yes," Frank said. She did not push it further. She set her bag down carefully, as though she was not certain she had the right to put it on the floor, and she turned and looked at him with those gray eyes that he had already noticed were the kind that saw too much. "Thank you," she said. It was simple and direct and without performance, and it hit him somewhere behind his sternum in a way he did not examine too closely. "Supper's at 6, he said. "Outhouse is around back. There's a basin and pitcher on the dresser." He closed the door and went back to the barn and spent 20 minutes doing work that did not need doing, because the alternative was standing in his own kitchen thinking about the fact that there was a woman in Margaret's room, and it did not feel like a betrayal, and he did not know what to do with that. Birdie Barrett had been born in 1856 in a small town in eastern Tennessee, to a mother who took in laundry and a father who sold patent medicines from a wagon, until the law in 3 counties made that untenable. She had grown up understanding that respectability was a performance, and that the distance between a good name and a ruined one was mostly a matter of geography and timing. She had been educated by a schoolteacher aunt until she was 14, and then her father had died, and then her mother had died 2 years after that, and then she had made a series of decisions that were individually defensible and collectively disastrous. She had worked as a governess in Memphis. She had worked as a seamstress in Nashville. She had made the catastrophic decision, at 22, to trust a man named Wallace Creed who presented himself as a land investor, and was, in fact, a confidence man of the first order. She had been in love with Wallace Creed in the way that people are sometimes in love with things that are bad for them, completely and without the reserve that would have protected her. And when he disappeared, he took with him $400 that represented everything she had saved in 6 years of careful work, and he also took with him her name. Not literally. But a con man's exposure leaves a wide shadow, and Birdie had been close enough to Wallace Creed's operation that some of that shadow had fallen across her. There had been a warrant in Memphis, technically for fraud, though the charges were eventually dropped for lack of evidence, but the warrant itself had been enough. Her name was in the record. The story, stripped of nuance and context, read simply enough: a woman associated with a known confidence man. She had spent 3 years since then moving west, working honest jobs, keeping her head down, trying to outrun the particular kind of reputation that, once established, traveled faster than the woman it belonged to. She had not told any of this to Frank Ramsey when she sat across from him at his kitchen table that first night and ate his plain, competent cooking and answered his careful questions in carefully partial truths. She had told him her name. That much was real. She had told him she was coming from Wichita. That was true in the technical sense that she had passed through Wichita. She had told him she was looking for work. That was entirely true. What kind of work, he asked. He was eating without looking at his food, watching her with that level, unhurried attention that she was already learning was simply how he engaged with the world. "Whatever is honest and available," she said. He considered that. "There's a dry goods store in town, the Harmon brothers, that I heard mention of needing a clerk." Mrs. Alderdus, the schoolteacher, had a daughter helping her with the younger children, but the daughter married in September and moved to Pratt County. "I can do either," she said. "You've got schooling." "Enough," he nodded. He passed her the corn bread without being asked because her bowl was empty and he had noticed. She took a piece and thanked him and thought, with a complicated feeling she could not entirely name, that she could not remember the last time someone had noticed without being asked. After supper, she washed the dishes without discussion, because it was the obvious right thing to do, and she was not in the habit of letting debts accumulate. And Frank Ramsey stood in the kitchen doorway watching her, with an expression she did not turn around to see but could feel in the particular quality of the silence. "You said one night," he said, when she had dried the last dish and hung the cloth on the rack. "Yes," she said. "Town's 4 miles in the dark and the mud," he said. "The stage won't run again until Thursday." She turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, not blocking the door, just occupying the space in the way that large, careful men sometimes do, and his face was doing that thing she was already beginning to recognize, which was showing exactly what he was thinking and absolutely none of the urgency behind it. "You're inviting me to stay until Thursday," she said. "I'm saying it's 4 miles and dark and muddy," he said. "I'm not inviting anything. I'm stating facts." She looked at him for a long moment. "I will earn my keep," she said. "I expect so," he said. Thursday came and she had found work at the schoolhouse because it turned out that Mrs. Alderdis, whose name was Ruth and who was 61 years old and had been teaching in Caldwell since before it was properly a town, had been hoping for someone with exactly Birdie's combination of basic Latin and precise handwriting to help with the older students. The pay was minimal. The work was real. The work was, in fact, the first thing in 3 years that made Birdie feel like she was standing on solid ground. Frank said nothing about the schoolwork. He said nothing about the fact that she had not mentioned leaving on Thursday. He made a slightly larger pot of oatmeal on Friday morning without comment, and she ate it without comment, and the silence between them was companionable in a way that neither of them remarked upon because remarking upon it would have required acknowledging it. She paid him. That was important to her. She gave him $2 at the end of her first week of pay, which was a third of what she earned, and pressed it into his hand, and said it was for the room and the food. And he said it was too much, and she said it was not enough, and they reached a compromise at $1.50 that pleased neither of them, and therefore felt fair. The weeks moved. October became November, and the Kansas cold arrived with the particular determination of a climate that has no patience for sentiment. Frank put heavy wool blankets on the bed in the spare room without being asked, and Birdie found the woodpile one morning and split enough kindling for a week, and Frank found this when he came in from the barn, and stood looking at the neat stack for a moment before going back to his work. They were careful with each other. Deliberately, consciously careful, the way people are when they are managing something fragile without admitting that it exists. She learned things about him in the way you learn things about someone you live in close quarters with, through what they do and don't do, through their habits and their silences. He was meticulous about the animals. He read by the lamp every night, history books mostly, and once a month a newspaper he had mailed from Kansas City. He drank 1 cup of rye whiskey before bed and never more than 1. He was patient to an almost maddening degree with things that were difficult, a mule that didn't want to be shod, a fence post that kept working loose from the frost-heaved ground, a neighbor's cattle that broke through the south fence for the 3rd consecutive week. He was less patient with himself. She noticed that. He held himself to a standard of physical and moral precision that occasionally made her want to ask him who he was trying to prove something to. But she did not ask, because she was not in a position to throw stones on that particular subject. November became December, and the first snow came, and Birdie stood at the window of the spare room watching it fall across the prairie in the early dark, and thought with a clarity that surprised her that she did not want to leave. That thought frightened her considerably. She had a hidden motive, or rather she had a hidden history, which amounted to the same thing where other people's trust was concerned. She was living in Frank Ramsey's house under a version of her name and story that was true in its outlines and incomplete in its essential details, And Frank Ramsey was a man who she had quickly come to understand was fundamentally honest, and the distance between those two things was a problem she had been choosing not to look at directly. She told herself she would leave in the spring. She told herself there was no point in disrupting what was working for both of them before the roads were clear and the weather was manageable. She told herself a great many sensible things that had nothing to do with the real reason she stayed, which was that she had begun to feel, in Frank Ramsey's house with its braided rugs and its wood stove and its lamplit evenings and its 1 cup of rye whiskey, something she had not felt in such a long time that she had almost stopped believing she could feel it. She had begun to feel safe. December brought Christmas, which they celebrated without ceremony and without awkwardness, which was its own small miracle. She found a book in the dry goods store in Caldwell, a history of the natural world of the American plains, and she wrapped it in brown paper and left it by the wood stove on Christmas morning. He had left, folded over the back of the kitchen chair where she always draped her coat, a pair of good winter gloves made of soft leather, with a precision of fit that suggested he had paid some attention to her hands. She had held the gloves for a long moment, alone in the kitchen, before she put them on. "They fit," she said, when he came in from the morning feeding. "Good," he said. He read his new book that evening. She read the months-old newspaper he had finished with. Outside, the snow moved against the house with a sound like breathing. The lamp made a warm circle on the table between them. The wood stove ticked. It was, she thought later, one of the most complete evenings of her adult life. January was hard. A full blizzard in the 3rd week kept them both inside for 4 days, burning through the woodpile at a rate that made Frank grim and calculating about the remaining stock, and Birdie discovered that Frank Ramsey, confined to quarters by weather, became a man of startling and specific conversation. He talked about the grass. He talked about the politics of land ownership in Kansas, the pressure from the cattle interests, the homesteaders trying to hold ground, the railroads angling at all of it from a third direction. He talked about his father's farm in Missouri, the black soil river bottom land, the particular smell of it after rain. He did not talk about Margaret. But he did once, very carefully, in the middle of a conversation about something entirely different, say, "My wife," she would have laughed at that, and then look away from Birdie with the expression of a man who has said more than he intended. "Tell me about her," Birdie said quietly. He was quiet for a long time. Snow moved against the window. "She was from a good family in Jefferson City," he said finally. "Too good, her mother thought, for a man like me. She was stubborn about that, about choosing me anyway. She was stubborn about most things. She had red hair." He paused. "She died in April of 1880, fever. I couldn't stop it. The doctor from Wichita was 3 days away, and by the time he got here it didn't matter." "I'm sorry," Birdie said. "It was not adequate. She did not try to make it more." He nodded once and looked at the fire, and the subject closed as gently as it had opened, and something shifted between them in that moment. Some wall thinned by a degree, and Birdie felt it and was terrified by it and would not have had it any other way. February brought a particular torture that she had not anticipated, which was the arrival in Caldwell of Frank's nearest neighbor, a man named Cal Holt, with his wife Clara and a piece of news. Cal Holt was a pleasant-faced, largely harmless man of middle age, and his wife Clara was the kind of capable, cheerful frontier woman who made Birdie feel both admiration and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been performing competence for years without it being recognized. The news was about a man named Holt Deegan. Holt Deegan was Cal Holt's younger brother by a different flavor, which is to say he shared the family name but not its better qualities. He had arrived in Caldwell from Dodge City 2 days prior, Cal said, and he was asking around about land, and he was also, more to the point, asking around about recent arrivals to the area. Birdie heard this from the kitchen where she was making coffee, and her hands went still on the coffee grinder. "Recent arrivals," she repeated, coming to the kitchen doorway with the grinder in her hands. Cal Holt looked at her with the mild curiosity of a man who has not yet understood the weight of what he has said. Just something he mentioned in passing, Cal said. Holtz always had schemes going. Don't pay him too much mind. Frank was looking at Birdie. She could feel it. She smiled at Cal Holt and asked if he took sugar and went back to the kitchen and put both hands flat on the wooden counter and breathed. After the Holts left, Frank came into the kitchen. She had her back to him, washing the coffee cups. "You know who Holt Deegan is," Frank said. It was not a question. "I have never met him personally," she said, "but you know of him." She put down the cup she was washing and turned around. Frank was leaning against the door frame, arms crossed, watching her with that dark, steady regard that she had come to understand could hold an enormous amount of pressure without releasing it. "He is associated with a man named Wallace Creed," she said, "who is a confidence man out of Nashville and Memphis, and for the past several years, various Western territories. And you know Wallace Creed." She had known this moment would come. She had known it with the certainty of someone who has spent years looking over their shoulder, who knows the shape of the thing pursuing them even before they can see its face. 3 years ago," she said, "I was in Memphis. I was working as a seamstress. I met a man named Wallace Creed who told me he was a land investor. I believed him. I was involved with him for several months before I understood what he actually was. When his operation collapsed, I was investigated as a co-conspirator. The charges were eventually dropped, but my name was associated with his, and that association has followed me." Frank's face was still. His jaw was tight. "Is there a warrant currently outstanding for you?" he asked. "No," she said. "The charges were dropped. There is no warrant. There is nothing legally actionable. There is only a story, and the story told without context makes me sound like something I am not. And Holt Deegan knows this story. Holt Deegan worked with Wallace Creed," she said. "He would know my name. He might know my face. And men like Holt Deegan do not come to a new town asking about recent arrivals because they are feeling sociable." "What does he want?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Money, probably. That's what men like Holt Deegan always want. A story he can sell or a secret he can rent." Frank pushed off the doorframe and walked to the kitchen window. He stood looking out at the February fields, the bare gray-brown grass under the iron sky, the fence line running straight and true toward the creek. "You should have told me," he said. His voice was quiet and absolutely without the heat that would have made it easier. The absence of heat was in fact much harder. "Yes," she said, "from the beginning." "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. "Frank," she said. "I'm thinking," he said. She waited. "Are you safe?" he asked. "Not legally. Personally. Is there a reason to be afraid of this man beyond what he might say?" The question hit her in an unexpected place because it was not the question she had been bracing for. She had been bracing for anger, for the entirely reasonable, entirely justified reaction of a man who had been deceived in his own house. She had not been prepared for the first thing out of his mouth to be a question about her safety. "I don't believe he would hurt me," she said carefully. "He is the kind of man who prefers leverage to violence. Leverage is worth more and carries fewer legal consequences." Frank nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated, not sure what it meant. He turned from the window. "You'll need to tell me everything, not a partial version." "Everything." "Frank, I cannot help you if I don't know the full picture," he said. "And I intend to help you. That is not up for discussion." She stared at him. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment in a way that was, for the first time in all the weeks she had known him, something she could not entirely read. "Because you split a week's worth of kindling without being asked," he said. "Because you wash the dishes every single night even when you're exhausted. Because you are the first person in 2 years who has talked to me like a human being rather than a tragedy. And because whatever you were 3 years ago in Memphis, I know what you are now. And I am not in the habit of abandoning what I know to be true because someone else has a different version of the story." Birdie Barrett, who had not cried in front of another person since the morning she found her mother dead in the house in Tennessee, felt the particular dangerous pressure behind her eyes that meant she was close. She blinked it back. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make more coffee. I'll tell you everything." She told him everything. It took 2 hours and 3 cups of coffee. She told him about Wallace Creed and the land investment scheme that had taken in 47 people across 4 states. She told him about the way she had been used, her knowledge of bookkeeping, her ability to talk to investors' wives because she looked and sounded respectable, her complete and genuine ignorance of what the money was actually doing. She told him about the night the marshals came, and the 6 weeks she had spent in a Memphis boarding house while the case was investigated, and the attorney she could not afford but found anyway in the form of an old friend of her father's who had practiced law in Knoxville. She told him about the 3 years of moving west, the jobs and the towns, and the names she had considered using instead of her own. She had never actually taken a different name. That had felt like a line she was not willing to cross. She was Birdie Barrett, and Birdie Barrett was innocent of the things she was accused of, and using another name would have meant conceding that the accusation was the truth. Frank listened to all of it without interrupting, except to ask clarifying questions that were precise and practical, and indicated that he was tracking every detail with the kind of attention he gave to everything that mattered to him. When she finished, they sat for a moment in silence. "Holt Deegan," Frank said. "What does he know specifically?" "He would know my name and that I was investigated," she said. "He might know the charges were dropped. He might not. Men like him sometimes prefer not to know things that undermine their leverage. He doesn't know you're here specifically." Cal said he was asking about recent arrivals generally. "He might have tracked me to Kansas. He might not be looking for me specifically. He might be running a completely unrelated scheme that has nothing to do with me." "But you don't believe that?" She held his gaze. "No, I don't believe that." Frank was quiet for another moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup, which was empty, held it, set it down. "I need to know something," he said, "and I need you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is not what you think I want to hear." "All right," she said. "Do you want to stay in Caldwell?" he asked. "Not in my house specifically. In this town, in this county. Is this where you want to be, or have you just run out of road?" The question opened something in her that she had been keeping firmly closed for weeks. "I want to stay," she said. Her voice, to her own ears, was steadier than she felt. "Mrs. Alderdis is going to retire in the spring. She has already asked if I would consider taking the school. It's not much, but it's real. It's the first real thing I've had in 3 years. And Caldwell is—" She stopped. "What?" Frank said. "Caldwell is where you are," she said quietly. "And I know that is not something I should say, and I know it makes this more complicated than it needs to be, but you asked me to be honest, and I cannot be honest about wanting to stay without being honest about that too." The kitchen was very quiet. Frank Ramsey put his elbows on the table and laced his hands together and looked at them for a long moment. "I am going to need you to be patient with me," he said finally. "I know," she said. "I am not—" He paused. "I am not a fast-moving man. I know that too. But I hear you," he said. He looked up. "And I think you should know that what you just said is the least complicated thing you've told me today." She felt the warmth of that land in her chest and expand, and she looked down at the table and pressed her lips together and tried very hard not to let it show on her face. And from the small, contained shift in his expression, she understood that she had not entirely succeeded. March came in with mud and wind, and the particular exhausted hopefulness of early plain spring. Birdie went to the school every day and taught reading and arithmetic, and a little geography to children ranging in age from 6 to 14. She walked the 4 miles to town in the mornings, and Frank drove the wagon to collect her in the evenings, which was not strictly necessary but had become the arrangement by mutual and entirely unspoken agreement. She loved the children. She had not known she would love the children. She had expected to find the work satisfying in the dutiful way that honest work is always satisfying. But what she found instead was something more electric and surprising, the particular joy of watching a child's face when something previously opaque became suddenly, brilliantly clear. A 7-year-old named Thomas Birch, who could not read in January, was reading whole sentences by March, halting and proud and so earnest it made her throat tight. She wrote to Mrs. Alderdice, who had retired to her daughter's house in Emporia, and reported Thomas's progress, and Mrs. Alderdice wrote back a warm, sensible letter that made no reference to anything improper about Birdie's living arrangement, which was more than could be said for everyone in Caldwell. There was talk. Of course there was talk. A woman living in an unmarried man's house was always going to generate talk in a frontier town in 1883, regardless of the very separate sleeping arrangements and the entirely professional nature of their daily coexistence. Birdie knew about the talk. Frank knew about the talk. They handled it in their respective fashions. Birdie by being so relentlessly professional and visible and competent at the schoolhouse that it became awkward to publicly impugn her, and Frank by being frank, which is to say by looking at anyone who raised the subject with a level, uncommunicative gaze until the subject found somewhere else to be. It was Cal Holt's wife Clara who, in the way that good-natured, perceptive women sometimes do, said the plainest version of the thing out loud. She came into town on a Wednesday in early March and found Birdie at the schoolhouse after the children had gone, washing the chalkboard, and she sat down in the biggest student's chair and said without preamble, "You and Frank Ramsey are going to drive each other to distraction if you don't stop being so careful." Birdie turned from the chalkboard. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "Yes, you do," Clara said pleasantly. "He watches you when you're not looking and stops when you are. And you do the same exact thing, and both of you are too proud to be the first one to say anything about it, and meanwhile half of Caldwell is speculating and the other half thinks you're already secretly married." "We are not secretly married," Birdie said. "I know that, honey," Clara said. "I'm just saying. The man buried his wife 3 years ago, and I have never seen him look at anything the way he looks at you. And from where I sit you look right back the same way when you think no one's watching. Life on the plains is short and hard, Birdie Barrett. Don't waste so much of it being careful." Birdie wrung out the chalkboard cloth and hung it very precisely on the hook beside the board. "It is more complicated than it appears from the outside," she said. "It usually is," Clara said equably. "That doesn't mean it has to be impossible." Holt Deegan came to Caldwell in the second week of March. Birdie saw him before he saw her, which was the only good luck she had in the entire situation. She was coming out of the post office on a Thursday morning, and he was coming along the boardwalk from the direction of the saloon, and she recognized him from 2 meetings in Memphis 3 years prior, a slender man with a narrow face and the particular flat eyes of someone who has never made peace with the fact that other people have feelings. She turned and went back into the post office and stood in the dim interior, her heart beating fast, and thought with quick, cold clarity. Holt Deegan was here. He had found Caldwell. Whether he had tracked her specifically or arrived by coincidence was now functionally irrelevant. He was here. She slipped out the side door of the post office and went directly to the livery where Frank kept his second horse, the chestnut mare he sometimes left for her to ride to town. And she took the mare and she rode the 4 miles to the homestead at a pace that was not quite a gallop but faster than prudent, and she walked into the kitchen where Frank was mending harness at the table and said, "He's here." Frank set down the harness. "Where?" "The saloon or near it. He doesn't know I've seen him." "I don't think he spotted me yet." Frank was quiet for a moment. He got up and went to the window, which showed nothing except the yard and the fence and the bare early spring fields. "All right," he said. "Frank, if he starts talking, he will start talking," Frank said. "That is what men like him do. You understand that we need to be ahead of it." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" she said. "I mean that a story told first, by the person it belongs to, in a town where people have spent 5 months watching that person be nothing but honest and hardworking and genuinely good at her job, lands differently than a story told by a stranger who arrived last week from Dodge City." She stared at him. "You want me to tell people," she said. "Not everything," he said, "but enough, the shape of it, that you were investigated for something you didn't do and cleared. That someone connected to the original situation has followed you here. Ruth Alderdice is one of the most respected people in this county. Clara Holt is the second, If you tell them the truth before Holt Deegan tells his version, you control the narrative. She was quiet for a moment, turning this over. And if they don't believe me, she said. Then we deal with that, he said. But I think they will. He paused. You've been here since October, Birdie. People know who you are, not your history, you. That counts for something. She felt the familiar fear pressing at the back of her mind, the dark past fear, the exposure fear, the fear of being seen entirely and found insufficient. She had been running from that fear for 3 years, and it was still there, reliable and specific and shaped like her own face. She also felt, looking at Frank Ramsey standing in his kitchen with harness leather on the table and absolute steadiness in his eyes, something else. Trust. She felt trust. All right, she said. It was not easy. Nothing about it was easy. She sat with Clara Holt the following Friday and told her the full story, including the parts she was ashamed of, including the part where she had loved Wallace Creed and been wrong about him in ways that still made her feel stupid, even though she knew better than to attach stupidity to being deceived. Clara listened with the focused attention of someone who has survived enough of her own life to know that the world is full of women who have been wrong about men and wrong about trust and still managed to build something true from what was left. When Birdie finished, Clara said, "Is Frank Ramsey standing by you?" "He is," Birdie said. "Then I am too," Clara said, as simply as that. Ruth Alderdice was even simpler. She read Birdie's letter, which Birdie wrote because Ruth was in Emporia and the situation could not wait for a visit, and she wrote back by return post, which in those days meant 3 days, and the letter said, among other things, "I hired you because I could see what you were, Birdie, not what someone else said you were. Nothing you have told me changes what I can see. Hold your head up. You have earned that." Holt Deegan made his move on a Monday morning. He came to the schoolhouse between the morning sessions, when the children had gone to their homes for the midday meal, and Birdie was alone at her desk. She heard his step on the schoolhouse porch, and she did not startle because she had been expecting this, and she looked up when he opened the door with the expression of a woman who is not afraid, even though she was considerably. "Miss Barrett," Holt Deegan said. He had the kind of smile that had been constructed with care and stopped precisely at the waterline of his eyes. "Or is it Mrs. Somebody or other now? These frontier towns do love to give a woman a fresh start." "Mr. Deegan," she said. "Close the door, you're letting in the cold." He came in. He looked around the schoolhouse with the particular contempt of a man who has spent his life in cities, or at least in larger towns, and finds small-scale honest endeavor slightly absurd. "Schoolteacher," he said. "That's rich, really, given what I know about your educational activities back in Memphis." "What is it you want?" she asked. She kept her voice steady. She was extremely proud of how steady her voice was. "What I always want," he said. "Just a little consideration. A little gratitude, you might say, for my ongoing discretion about certain facts that certain people in this community might find very interesting." "The charges against me were dropped 3 years ago," she said. "There is no warrant. There is nothing legally actionable. If you intend to go around town telling stories about me, I should tell you that I have already had those conversations myself with the people in this community whose opinions matter, and they are already in possession of the facts." Something moved across his narrow face. It was not quite anger, but it was the absence of the advantage he had assumed he had, and in a man who trades in leverage, that is effectively the same thing. "Is that right?" he said slowly. "It is," she said, "and I suppose that big quiet fellow out at the South Homestead is right behind you on this." "Frank Ramsey has nothing to do with this," she said. "This is my matter and I am handling it." "Is he now?" Deegan said, ignoring the last part completely. "Because I heard an interesting thing in the saloon last night. I heard that Frank Ramsey is in the middle of a significant land deal with the Caldwell Cattlemen's Association, something to do with grazing rights along the creek. That's the kind of deal that depends very heavily on a man's reputation." She felt the cold settle into her chest. This was the thing she had been afraid of, not herself, him. "The deal has nothing to do with me," she said. It does if the woman living in his house turns out to be a known associate of Wallace Creed's confidence operation, Deegan said pleasantly. Men of business get nervous about those associations. It's just human nature. She stood up. Get out of my school, she said. $200, he said, and I leave Caldwell on the next stage and you never hear from me again. Get out, she said. He shrugged. He put his hat back on. Think about it, he said. I'll be in town until Thursday. He left. She sat back down. Her legs were not entirely reliable. She sat at her desk in the empty schoolhouse with her hands flat on the surface and thought about what she had just been told. $200. A threat she did not have the money to meet, against a man who did not deserve to have his livelihood threatened, by a person who knew precisely where to aim. She could leave. She had left before. The thought was there, and she looked at it with the cold clarity of someone who has used it before, who knows the shape and weight of it. She could pack the carpetbag and be on the stage before Deegan had collected his $200 from someone else. She could leave and Frank Ramsey's land deal would be safe, and the school board would find someone else, and Caldwell would close over her absence like water over a stone. She thought about the wildflowers she had seen that morning along the fence line. The first ones of spring, purple and tentative and impossibly there against the black soil. She thought about the way Frank Ramsey had looked at her across the kitchen table that morning with his coffee cup in his hands and said, completely unprompted, Thomas Birch read me a whole paragraph yesterday when I stopped by the school to bring you that parcel. You should have seen his face. She thought about the blue glass vase in the spare room, and the leather gloves that fit her hands exactly, and the 1 cup of rye whiskey, and the evenings, the warm, lamplit, patient evenings that had slowly, without her full permission, become the structure her life was built around. She was not going to leave. She was done running. She went to find Frank. She found him at the far south fence, replacing the posts the Holt cattle had knocked loose again, and she watched him work for a moment before he heard her and turned. She told him about Deegan's visit. She told him about the $200. She told him because she had promised herself she was done with partial truths about the threat to his land deal. When she finished, Frank set down his post driver. He mentioned the grazing rights deal, Frank said. Yes. He looked at the fence line for a moment. The deal is essentially done, he said. The papers were signed last week. Even if Deegan managed to stir something up with the association, the legal documents are already filed. Birdie stared at him. You didn't tell me that, she said. You didn't ask, he said, and there was the ghost of something that was not quite a smile in the corner of his mouth. Also, it seemed like you had enough on your mind. Frank, she said. The deal is done, he said. Deegan has no leverage against my business. Which leaves only the social leverage, which is to say gossip, which you have apparently already largely diffused. He picked up the post driver again, then set it back down. I am going to go speak to him. Frank, not threatening, he said. I am simply going to have a conversation. Man to man, as they say. A conversation in which I explain that his leverage does not exist, and that the community of Caldwell is currently in possession of enough information to make anything he says sound like exactly what it is, which is the story of a man who works for confidence artists trying to shake down a school teacher. And if he doesn't listen, then I will point out to him that Marshall Tillman in Caldwell is a man with some history with the Creed operation, having lost a nephew to one of Creed's land schemes in 1879, and that if Holt Deegan is currently running any kind of scheme in or around Caldwell, the marshal would be very interested to know about it. She stared at him. Is that true? She said. About the marshal. Marshall Tillman's nephew is a real person, and the 1879 scheme is real, Frank said. Whether Deegan is currently running a scheme in Caldwell or just passing through opportunistically is something we do not know, but Deegan doesn't know that we don't know. She stared at him a little longer. You have been thinking about this, she said. I have been thinking about this since February, he said. Since Cal told us Deegan was asking around, I have been thinking about exactly what I would say when this conversation became necessary. Since February, she repeated. Since February, he confirmed. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes that she had spent months learning and still felt she was only at the beginning of understanding. "I told you I intended to help you." That was not a momentary impulse. The Kansas wind moved across the prairie between them, carrying the smell of thawed earth and early grass and the faintest thread of wildflower, and Birdie Barrett looked at Frank Ramsey and felt the last wall she had built come down without a sound. "Frank," she said. Her voice was not as steady as she would have liked. "Not now," he said quietly. "Let me deal with Deegan first. Then we'll talk, all right." She pressed her lips together and nodded. He went into town that afternoon. He was back before dark. He came into the kitchen where she had made supper, a proper supper, the best thing she knew how to cook, which was a rabbit stew with the dried herbs from the kitchen garden and the last of the winter root vegetables, and he hung his hat and coat and sat down at the table and looked at the stew. "He's leaving Thursday," Frank said. "He won't be back." "What did you say to him?" she asked. "I said what I said I would say," Frank said. "And then I said one more thing." "What?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I told him that Birdie Barrett was going to be a permanent resident of this county," Frank said carefully, not looking at her. "And that anyone who had a problem with that was going to have to deal with me on an ongoing basis, and that I have a 40-acre property and a valid contract with the Cattlemen's Association and a reputation in this county for being a man who does not let things go." The kitchen was very still. "You told him I was going to be a permanent resident," she said. "I did." "That was presumptuous of you," she said. "It was," he agreed. He looked up. His jaw was doing that thing where it was tight and controlled, and underneath it was something much less controlled, and his eyes were the most direct they had ever been, which for Frank Ramsey was saying something. "I would like it to be true." She put the lid back on the stew pot. She turned around. She looked at him across the kitchen, across the table with its familiar scratches and coffee rings and the kerosene lamp burning between them, and she thought about every moment from the October road to this one, every conversation in silence and careful almost and not quite, and she thought enough. "You are the most deliberately slow-moving man I have ever met," she said. "Yes," he said. "It has been 5 months." "It has," he said. "And you have been thinking about this since February." "Since before February, if I am being honest," he said. She walked around the table. She stood in front of him and he looked up at her, and she could see in his face everything that he had been carefully, painstakingly managing for months, and it was not a small thing. It was large and real and specific, and it was directed entirely at her. She put her hand against his face, her palm against the uneven line of his jaw where the old break had healed imperfectly, and he closed his eyes for a moment in a way that made her chest ache. "Frank Ramsey," she said. "Birdie," he said. "I am not a fast-moving woman either," she said. "But I would like you to tell me what you actually feel, not what you think I want to hear, not what is practical, what you actually feel." He opened his eyes. "I love you," he said. It was not complicated. It was the least complicated thing he had said in 5 months. "I have loved you since you told me your $11 was functionally equivalent to having people in Caldwell, and I knew you were going to be trouble and I invited you anyway, and I have not been sorry for a single day." She bent down and kissed him. He kissed her back with the particular intensity of someone who has been waiting a very long time to do something, and has thought about it enough to know exactly how to do it. And she felt the warmth of it travel through her entire body, and settle in the place where the stone of her dark past, and her hidden motive, and her running, and her fear had been sitting for 3 years. And it displaced all of those things with something that was simply his name and her name, and the smell of rabbit stew, and the lamp burning, and the wildflowers just beginning outside the window. They stayed in the kitchen for a long time, talking and not talking, and the stew was slightly overcooked by the time they ate it, and neither of them minded at all. Holt Deegan left Caldwell on the Thursday stage, as he had promised, and as far as anyone could tell he did not look back. Spring came to the Kansas plains the way it always did, slowly and then all at once, the grass coming up green and urgent from the winter-brown ground, the cottonwoods along the creek putting out their first pale leaves, the meadowlarks returning to the fence posts. The wildflowers came up along the homestead fence line in the first week of April, purple coneflowers and golden prairie sunflowers and white asters, a long bright margin against the dark soil. Birdie saw them from the spare room window and stood looking at them for a long time, and then she went and found Frank in the barn and said, without any particular lead-up, "I would like to stop being a temporary resident of this room." He looked up from the piece of tack he was cleaning. "What sort of arrangement did you have in mind?" he asked, in a voice that was extremely careful about not revealing how much this question mattered to him. "Marriage," she said, "if you're asking." "I was planning to ask," he said. "When?" she said. "Today," he said. "I have been working up to it since breakfast." She looked at him. "Ask then," she said. He put down the tack. He stood up. He looked at her with the full force of those dark, honest eyes in that weathered, imperfect, entirely beloved face, and he said, "Birdie Barrett, will you marry me?" Not because it would solve a practical problem or resolve a social awkwardness, but because I want to spend the rest of my life having someone split my kindling without being asked, and tell me the truth, even when it's complicated, and sit across from me by the lamp in the evenings. Because you are the most real person I have met since I came to Kansas and possibly since I have been alive. Because I love you and I want you to know that every day in a way that is official and permanent and formal, and whatever other word makes it clear that I mean it forever. She took a breath. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He crossed the barn in 2 steps and she met him halfway, and this time the kiss was different from the kitchen kiss. Less surprised and more certain, and it lasted long enough that the horse in the nearest stall bumped its door with impatient commentary. They were married in May of 1883 by the circuit preacher who came through Caldwell on his monthly rounds, a tall, angular man named Reverend Case, who married people with the same practical efficiency. He applied to funerals and christenings, and who seemed to find the whole enterprise deeply satisfying. Clara Holt cried, which surprised Birdie, because Clara did not strike her as a woman given to crying, and then Clara blamed the spring pollen, and Birdie thanked her for coming and for everything else, and Clara pressed her hand and said, "You're good for him, and he's good for you. That's the whole story right there." Ruth Alderdis sent a letter from Emporia with a pressed wildflower inside it and the words, "I told you to hold your head up. You did." Frank moved Margaret's things with great care into a cedar trunk, which he placed in the corner of what had been the spare room and was now his and Birdie's room. He did not put the trunk in the barn or discard anything. He kept the blue glass vase on the shelf, and Birdie did not ask him to move it, because she understood by now the specific quality of Frank Ramsey's heart, which was large enough to hold both the love he had lost and the love he had found without one diminishing the other, and she thought that was not a limitation but a grace. The school board formally hired Birdie as the head teacher of the Caldwell School District in June, with a modest salary increase and a letter of commendation from the county superintendent that arrived in an official envelope, and which Birdie read twice, and then folded very precisely and put in the cedar chest beside her marriage certificate. Summer on the plains was hot and long and golden. They worked. They worked hard, both of them in the way of people who have found their place and intend to keep it. Frank expanded the cattle operation, buying 6 additional head that fall from a rancher in the strip whose herd had grown beyond his grazing capacity. Birdie's school grew too because the county was growing, homesteaders filing claims on the available land, families with children who needed educating. She was good at it. She allowed herself to understand, genuinely talented at it. She could feel the shape of a child's confusion and find the exact angle of explanation that would resolve it, and she loved that precision, that particular satisfaction. She was also, by November, fairly certain that she was expecting a child. She told Frank on a Thursday evening by the stove. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, which was something unguarded and overwhelmed and purely, nakedly glad. "You're certain," he said. "Not entirely," she said, "but certain enough." He stood up and came to her and held her with the kind of careful care that made her feel, as he had always made her feel, that she was both precious and equal, both protected and autonomous. "I didn't think," he started. "I know," she said. "After Margaret," he said, and stopped again. "I know," she said, softer. They stood in the kitchen by the stove, while the November dark pressed against the windows, and the wood stove ticked, and somewhere far out on the plains a coyote said something brief and unintelligible to the winter sky. The baby was born in July of 1884, a boy, healthy and furious and loud about it, with dark hair like his father and gray eyes like his mother, and the absolute conviction, evident from his first hours, that the world owed him continuous attention. They named him James, after Frank's father, with Barrett as his middle name, and Birdie accepted this arrangement with a dignity that concealed considerable private pleasure. James Ramsey was a large, energetic presence in the homestead from his first day, and Frank Ramsey, who had spent years in the company of cattle and silence, adapted to his son's company with a thoroughness and delight that Birdie found so unexpected and so sweet that she sometimes had to leave the room briefly to collect herself. She watched him one evening in the early weeks, Frank sitting in the kitchen chair by the lamp with the baby across his forearms in the particular hold that James had decided was acceptable. The two of them in the amber lamplight, Frank's big careful hands around his son's back, and James temporarily quiet, looking up at his father with the deep and ancient seriousness that very young babies sometimes turn on the world, as if they are genuinely trying to understand it. She stood in the doorway and thought, with a fullness that made the old Birdie, the one who had walked out of Memphis with nothing but a carpetbag and $11, and a story she couldn't shake, seem like someone from a different life, that this was what it felt like to be exactly where you were supposed to be. Cal and Clara Holt came to meet James in his second week, and Clara held him with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised 4 of her own and said, "He's going to be a big one. Look at those hands, same as his father's." "God help us," Birdie said. "You'll manage," Clara said, which was both a prediction and a compliment. James was a good baby by the standards of most, and a spectacular baby by the standards of Frank, who had no prior baseline and therefore found every ordinary developmental milestone genuinely astonishing. He documented the first smile in a letter to his sister in Missouri, who wrote back that she had been wondering when Frank would get around to living properly, and she would like to come visit before the decade was out. The sister, whose name was Alina Ramsey and who had married a farmer in Sedalia and had 3 children of her own, came the following spring, which was 1885. She was 2 years younger than Frank, sharp and direct, and warm in the way of people who grew up in the same house as Frank Ramsey, and therefore know that warmth has to be stated clearly because it will not be assumed. She arrived on the Caldwell stage and Frank met her with the wagon, and Birdie stayed home with James, who was 10 months old, and managing the early stages of locomotion with the aggressive determination that characterized everything he did. And when the wagon came up the road, Birdie came out to the porch with the baby on her hip, and Alina Ramsey climbed down from the wagon and looked at her brother's wife and her brother's son and her brother's homestead and said, "Oh, Frank, you finally got it right." Frank said, "Alina," in a flat tone that meant he was very pleased but not going to say so. Birdie liked Alina immediately and without reservation, which surprised her, because she had not expected to have a sister and was not sure she knew how, and Alina treated her exactly as she treated everything, which was with complete and practical interest and no performance. They sat up late the first night after Frank and the baby had gone to bed, Alina and Birdie at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and Alina said without any particular lead-up, "He told me in a letter about what you came through, the Memphis situation and the man who followed you here." Birdie was quiet for a moment. "He told you," she said. "Because I asked," Alina said. "And because it was relevant to understanding who you were. He wasn't being indiscreet. He was trying to tell me something true about you." She paused. "What he actually said was, she faced it all down and she didn't run, and that told me everything I needed to know." Birdie looked at the lamp flame. "He said that," she said. "He did," Alina said. "And Frank does not say things he doesn't mean." "No," Birdie agreed. "He does not. He also said she makes the best rabbit stew I've ever had in my life," which was not relevant to anything but was clearly important to him. Birdie laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and undignified, and Alina laughed too, and from the bedroom there was a muffled sound from James, who was always difficult to keep asleep and was apparently monitoring the situation. "Go back to sleep, James," Birdie said toward the hallway. There was a brief pause and then silence. Alina looked impressed. "He listens to you already." "Not usually," Birdie admitted. "Tonight he's choosing to." Alina stayed for 2 weeks, and in that time she taught Birdie 3 recipes from their mother's kitchen in Missouri, assessed the cattle operation with a farmer's eye, and made 2 suggestions that Frank implemented immediately without acknowledging that he hadn't thought of them himself. And she played with her nephew in the kitchen every morning, with such unbridled enthusiasm that James went asleep every afternoon, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been having the best possible time. When she left, she hugged Frank at the stage and then hugged Birdie for longer, and said into her hair, "You make him happy in a way I was starting to worry he'd never be again." I won't forget that. After she was gone, Frank and Birdie drove back to the homestead in the late afternoon light, the spring prairie rolling gold and green on either side of the road, James asleep between them on the wagon bench, his solid warm weight leaning against Birdie's side. "She approves," Birdie said. "She approved from your first letter," Frank said. "She's been telling me to make a move since December of 1882. Birdie turned to look at him. "Alina knew about me in December of 1882. I wrote her in November," he said. "I said there was a woman in my spare room and she was going to be trouble." "You wrote your sister about me a month after I arrived," Birdie said. "Yes," he said. "What did she say?" "She said, quote, 'Don't be an idiot, Frank,'" he said. Birdie considered this. "I like Alina," she said. "I know," he said. By 1886 the homestead had grown. Frank had purchased an additional 20 acres from a neighbor who was moving to Colorado for his wife's health, and they had put in a proper kitchen garden that Birdie managed with the same focused attention she brought to everything, and which produced enough vegetables through the summer that they could trade surplus with the Holts and 2 other neighboring families. The cattle operation was solid. The school had expanded to a second room in a new building that the county had funded, with a second teacher, a young woman from Emporia named Miss Garvey, who was competent and earnest and slightly terrified of Birdie for the first month, and then became her firm ally. James was too, and a terror in the most delightful possible sense, into everything, talking in the continuous unstoppable commentary of a child who has recently discovered language and is not prepared to stop using it under any circumstances. He followed his father around the barn with the absolute conviction that he was helping, and Frank let him, with a patience that Birdie found astounding, handing him small tools and explaining the names of things and the purposes of things in the same quiet, precise way he explained everything. She was expecting again. She told Frank in October, and he looked at her with the same overwhelmed, unguarded gladness that had appeared on his face the first time, and then he said, "Are you all right?" "You look tired," she said. "Yes," he said. "It's different this time," she said. "I'm more tired than before, that's all." "I'll take the early morning feeding for the cattle," he said immediately. "You don't need to get up." "Frank, I know you'll do it anyway," he said. "But I'll get up first." She let him. It was one of the things she had learned about accepting love, which was that it was sometimes expressed in practical logistics rather than eloquent declarations, and refusing the logistics was not independence but foolishness. The second baby was born in May of 1887, another boy, smaller than James had been but equally loud about his opinions. They named him William after Birdie's long-dead father, which Frank had suggested without prompting and which Birdie had accepted with a gratitude that she expressed by not making a scene about it in front of anyone, because Frank would have found that embarrassing, and instead by holding his hand across the kitchen table that night and saying, "That was kind of you," and Frank saying, "It was the right name," in the way he said things that were the truest ones. James greeted William with the proprietary enthusiasm of a 2-year-old who has decided that a new baby is primarily a gift to him, and then with the slightly wounded confusion of a 2-year-old who has discovered that the gift makes noise and demands attention and cannot be returned. He adjusted. He was, Frank said with great parental satisfaction, going to be a reasonable person when he grew up. "That's a strong claim for a 2-year-old, Birdie said. "He gave William his wooden horse today," Frank said, "without being asked." "He might want something from William," Birdie said. "William is 2 months old," Frank said. "What could he possibly want from him?" "Approval," Birdie said. "Even babies have something to give." Frank looked at her for a moment with the expression he wore when she said something he found unexpectedly true. "That is exactly right," he said. "The years moved, the way they do in a life that is full and honest and anchored to real work and real love. The children grew." James started school in the autumn of 1889, 5 years old, and inclined to instruct his classmates on matters he had not yet fully mastered, which made him either a natural teacher or a natural problem depending on who you asked. Birdie, who was his mother and also his teacher, managed this with the particular equilibrium of someone who understands both the virtue and the hazard of confidence. William was more quiet, more watchful, more like his father in the particular way of second children who have learned that observation yields more information than commentary. He was fascinated by the cattle and by the horses and by the precise mechanisms of things, and Frank took him through the barn with an explanatory care that William absorbed with solemn attention, and then, aged 3, attempted to apply to the unfortunate kitchen cat with a combination of results. The Kansas plains changed through the 80s. The cattle drives thinned as the railroads reached further into the territory, and the old trail-driving era wound down. The homesteaders were thick on the ground now, the prairie broken into farms in every direction, the open range that had seemed limitless 15 years before increasingly fenced and claimed and managed. There were arguments about this, the old cattle interests and the new farming families, the tension between open-range tradition and the increasing reality of a settled agricultural landscape. Frank's position was complicated, as it usually is for people who understand both sides of a genuine conflict. He had come to Kansas as a homesteader, but he had made his living partly through the cattle operation, and he understood the cattlemen's arguments without being persuaded by their most extreme conclusions. He talked to the men on both sides, at the Cattlemen's Association meetings, and at the County Farmers Cooperative that had formed in 1886, with the same steady, unpresumptuous attention he brought to everything. He was asked to represent the county at a regional meeting in Wichita in the fall of 1888. He came home from that meeting with the grim satisfaction of a man who has done something useful and difficult, and told Birdie over supper that the parties had reached a compromise on the fence law that he thought would hold for at least a few years. "You were good at it," she said. "It was not a question." "I don't know about good," he said. "I was patient." "With you, those are the same thing," she said. He looked at her with that particular expression that she had been receiving for 6 years now and still found completely undone her, warm and direct and specific and entirely hers. "You should have been there," he said. "You would have been better." "I was here," she said, "teaching your eldest son that 2 + 2 is 4 and that this is not an opinion." "Is he still disputing it?" Frank said. "He is reserving judgment," Birdie said. "That's my son," Frank said with resignation and pride in equal measure. The autumn of 1889 brought a new development that Birdie had not anticipated and which struck her when it arrived, as the specific kind of justice that the world occasionally produces not by dramatic revelation, but by the quiet accumulation of time and evidence. A letter arrived from Nashville, Tennessee, addressed to her at the Caldwell School. She opened it at her desk after the children had gone for the afternoon. The return address was an attorney's office she did not recognize. Inside was a single formal page and a smaller folded note. The formal page was a legal document, brief and precisely worded, indicating that the estate of one Wallace Creed, deceased as of August 1889 in the territorial prison at Fort Smith, Arkansas, had been subject to asset recovery proceedings, and that as a result of those proceedings, a portion of the recovered funds had been allocated to identified victims of his operation. The amount allocated to Birdie Barrett, formerly of Memphis, Tennessee, formerly investigated and subsequently cleared in the matter of the Creed fraud operation, was $412. She sat at her desk for a long time holding the document. The smaller folded note was from the attorney, a brief personal addendum explaining that in the course of the estate proceedings, the full record of the original investigation had been reviewed, and that the attorney wanted her to know personally that the record was abundantly clear as to her position as a victim rather than a participant, and that the recovery amount was calibrated accordingly. $412. 12 more than he had taken from her. She thought about the man she had been 22 in Memphis, who had loved Wallace Creed with a completeness that still embarrassed her when she thought about it. The young woman who had believed in something false and paid the cost of that belief for years. She thought about the road outside Caldwell in October of 1882, the cold rain and the mud and the carpetbag, and the $11.40. She folded the papers very precisely and put them in her coat pocket and walked out of the school in the early autumn afternoon and got on the chestnut mare, Frank's second horse, which she still used because Frank had never brought himself to retire it even after they had a proper second horse for her use, and she rode the 4 miles home. Frank was at the fence line, the south fence that the Holt cattle had stopped coming through once Cal had sorted his own fence management, doing a routine check before winter. She rode up alongside him and he turned and read her face with the speed of 7 years of reading her face. "What is it?" he said. She handed him the papers. He read them. He was quiet. "Wallace Creed is dead," she said. "I see that," he said. "He died in prison," she said. "Yes." She got down from the horse and stood on the Kansas ground, the autumn prairie rolling away from them in every direction, the cottonwoods along the creek gone gold, the sky the deep hard blue of a plains fall afternoon, the fence line stretching straight and definite to the horizon. She could see the homestead from here, the stone house with its good solid roof, the barn, the kitchen garden gone to its autumn brown, the 2 wildflower patches she had planted along the fence lines, one at the south and one at the north, because after that first spring she had wanted them to be permanent. "He's gone," she said. "It's done." Frank put the papers in his own pocket and took her hand. His hand was warm and rough and entirely familiar, the weight of it against hers the most constant and reliable physical sensation in her life. "It was done before this," he said. "I know," she said. "It was done when you didn't run," he said. "It was done when you went to Clara Holt and Ruth Alderdis. It was done when you walked into that schoolhouse and told Holt Deegan to get out." She looked at the homestead. She looked at the Wildflowers bare now, gone to their winter state, but she knew exactly where they were and what they would be in April. "I know," she said again, "but it helps. It helps to know that the record is clear." "The record has been clear to everyone who mattered," he said. She leaned into him. He put his arm around her, the two of them standing in the autumn light at the south fence line, and she thought about all of it. The road and the rain and the spare room and the careful months and the wildflowers and the kitchen and the children and the years of honest work and real love, and the particular deep satisfaction of a life that had been built rather than inherited. built from nothing and near nothing and pure stubborn refusal to accept that the worst thing that had happened to her was the truth of who she was. "Let's go home," she said. "Yes," he said. They walked back to the house through the autumn grass, Frank leading the mare and Birdie beside him. And by the time they reached the porch, James and William had been released from school and were in the yard in the collision of energy that characterized every afternoon. And James called out something at full volume that was intended to be a greeting, but registered primarily as a declaration of intent. And William, who at 2 was still primarily in the business of following his brother and occasionally sitting down abruptly, looked up at them from the dirt of the yard with the calm gray eyes that were exactly Birdie's, and said in his serious small voice, "Mama, Papa, home." "Home," Frank agreed. Birdie crouched down and picked William up and settled him on her hip with the ease of a woman who has been carrying children for years, and he leaned against her shoulder with the boneless, absolute trust of a small child who has never had a reason to question whether he would be held. And she closed her eyes for a moment and felt it, the weight of him, the weight of everything, the good weight of a life that had turned out to be true. The following spring, the wildflowers came up along both fence lines, thicker than the year before, because they had been established now for years and the roots were deep. Purple coneflowers and golden sunflowers and the delicate white asters, all of it bright against the dark soil of the Kansas plains. James came to find her one morning when she was looking at them. He was 5½ and deeply opinionated about most things and only occasionally sentimental, but he stood beside her at the south fence and looked at the flowers with the genuine wonder that children bring to the world's beauty before they learn to be suspicious of it. "Why do they come back every year?" he asked. "Because the roots are there," she said, "even when you can't see them." He thought about this with the thoroughness he brought to everything. "Like our house," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "like our house." He nodded, satisfied with this, and ran back to whatever project had been interrupted by the flowers. And Birdie stood at the fence for another moment in the spring morning, with the meadowlarks calling from the fence posts, and the new grass coming up green in every direction, and the smoke rising from the chimney of the house where Frank was making breakfast, and William was almost certainly testing the limits of some domestic arrangement. And she thought of the woman on the October road with $11 and a carpetbag and a story she couldn't shake. She thought, you did all right, not the way you expected, not the way you planned. Not without cost, not without fear, not without the particular humiliation of being known in your worst light before you were known in your truest one. But all right, more than all right. She walked back to the house. Frank was at the stove. William was attempting to reach something on the lowest shelf of the pantry. James burst in the back door 30 seconds after Birdie and announced something about the barn cat with the specific urgency that suggested either catastrophe or breakfast. And Frank turned from the stove with his coffee cup and caught Birdie's eye across the bright, noisy, ordinary, extraordinary room. He raised an eyebrow. She smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had stopped running long enough for her life to find her, who had accepted one night in a spare room and stayed until the wildflowers came up and kept staying, year after year, because it turned out this was where the roots were. This was the ground she had been looking for. This was the home she had been heading toward through every displacement and every loss and every mile of Kansas road. Frank's mouth curved. His eyes were warm and direct and full of the specific, uncomplicated, permanent thing he had been offering her since the beginning. "Sit down," he said. "Breakfast is almost ready." She sat down. James sat down. William was retrieved from the pantry situation and installed in his chair. The breakfast was served, plain and good, and outside the window the Kansas spring poured in at every angle, green and gold and impossibly alive. The wildflowers bright along the fence line where she had planted them, coming up from roots that went deep and would not be moved. They ate. They were home.